Welcome to Venture Unscripted, a podcast where we talk with founders and entrepreneurs about their journey from 0 to 1.
Welcome, Nicole. We're going to be interviewing her about Biomimicry. She's the managing director there.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Awesome. So I'd love to get a little bit more background about you and biomimicry.
Yeah. So me and my intersection with biomimicry is really probably through the lens of sustainability is how I entered this world, this meme. And so I got into sustainability through my work at overstock.com. Mm-hmm. I was the managing director of sourcing there. So it was really under my purview to make sure that all the products that we sourced, because at this time, so Overstock grew from I think a $10 million to an $800 million company in a matter of 6 years. So the growth was intense, and just essentially the business platform was taking excess market goods and then selling them on this online platform. And as the company grew, there was only so much excess goods in the market, right? So we started sourcing our own and creating our own private label. And so at that point, that's what I was really charged to lead. And so of course, social compliance was very much part of who are the manufacturers that you're working with. But that was like around 2002. And so that's right when kind of corporate CSR started really surfacing as a thing, right? Like looking at social and environmental responsibility and what does that look like? And so it really fell onto my lap to be responsible for that. And so I really got into what does it look like to be socially and environmentally compliant? And the thing that I think really probably opened my eyes is that I became just privy to the manufacturing process. Like, you know, what does it actually take to make a chair, to make a flat screen TV, to make a down comforter, you know, all these like things that we just kind of buy, you know, as consumers as like, oh, that's cool. Great. I need a new set of dishes. Let me go buy them. You know, whatever it is that, you know, we've kind of bought into this consumerism society. Actually seeing the environmental impacts of that was pretty hard ground truth for me. And I think a lot of people in the sustainability space have had that experience, right? So I got really interested into how do we start solving for that? How do we make it less bad, right? Like that's kind of the first step is how do we not make it so bad? And that's really how I started to intersect with kind of just the sustainability world and going to conferences like Sustainable Brands and Green Biz and really starting to understand, you know, what does CSR look like? And what I noticed over a period of time is that everyone that we were having conversations with was continually focusing on short-term solutions, or what I also call tailpipe solutions. So like after the fact, right? Like no one was saying like, hey, let's not have plastic to begin with. That wasn't even at the table at that time. It barely is now, but you know, so that's when I kind of started thinking about like, well, how do we innovate differently? And what does innovation look like when we actually take a step back and take a more holistic approach of innovation? Because I think so much of innovation has really been historically centered around what are the human needs that we're solving for. But when we do that in isolation but you know, what are the human needs, but at the sacrifice of what else? You know, like if at the sacrifice of the environment, of social inequalities, you know, like there's a bigger picture here to just making a better product faster and cheaper, right? There's a better conversation to be had for the society that we want to be walking into in the future. And I think that's what really inspired me to start looking into what are innovation strategies that are more holistic in their approach, that are looking at, you know, life-centered design, life being, you know, more than just humans, but, you know, all the habitants on this planet that we are cohabitating with. You know, like we should be thinking about that because there's value in that. And we're starting to really understand, you know, the natural capital value and like all these sort of things just started really coalescing to help us now realize, oh, there is a better way to design. And so that's really kind of probably a much longer answer than you wanted, but really my intersection with biomimicry was, okay, this is a more holistic design approach that actually looks at nature as a reference point. And so our company name is Biomimicry 3.8. And our name is 3.8 because there's 3.8 billion years of R&D in nature that we can lean into, right? Like nature has been solving for these challenges, thermal regulation, water filtration, all these things that we talk about as issues today. Nature has some pretty cool design strategies to solve for that. And when I talk about biomimicry, particularly to businesses, what we talk about is looking to nature for solutions is a really incredible way to de-risk your innovation process, because these strategies are already there and they give us essentially this incredible leg up to start to solving for that problem in a really holistic and life-friendly way. So that's kind of the summary of how I got into biomimicry and why I feel it's most important in the sustainability and the innovation space that we are operating in today.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you basically were able to, at overstock.com, using your kind of your background in CSR and sustainability, bring that over to biomimicry and being able to help other organizations with that, essentially, to say, hey, how can we be more responsible inhabitants of the world, right? And how can we do that in a way that supports innovation and business, but we can still use some of the concepts that have been going on for a really long time in our world? Would you say accurate?
Yeah, totally accurate. And I think to add to that, my background is not biology. It's very much in business and finding strategies that can move businesses towards more positive design. So really a lot of my work at the company is finding value in bringing biomimicry into initiatives that the companies are already working on.
Sure.
Because the thing is like what we talk about is we don't want people to see biomimicry as like another thing, to do,
Right.
but really as a vehicle to achieve the goals you already have. So if your goals are centered around the sustainable development goals, if you have, well building design goals, if you have goals towards positive impact, net positive, what does that look like? Really, how does this become a vehicle for achieving that? Because it really is industry agnostic, and you can use biomimicry whether for product design, facility design, systems design. You can really use these innovations, these strategies and natural patterns from biology to really inform a conversation around innovation and sustainability in that space. So really a lot of my role is finding the intersection with companies and helping them find the business value based on the goals and objectives that they're trying to achieve.
That makes perfect sense. So it's not necessarily like, hey, let's do this separate initiative on the side. It's like, no. Let's look at your initiatives and almost use this as a vehicle. Like they're embedded. They're part of the initiative, right? So
Exactly.
yeah, that's
Exactly.
good. So can you give maybe an example or two of what that looks like for an organization? Maybe a more tangible example.
Yeah, I'll give a couple because I think it's important to kind of understand like the breadth
Yeah.
of application. So one example is, I'll give a packaging example because packaging is really hot right now in terms of looking at new innovations. So one of the first things that we do in our work is we break a company's challenge down to function. Right. So when we're talking about when a company comes to us and says, we have too much plastic in our product, we need to design it better. We want to reduce plastic out of our product. So then the first question we'd ask is, okay, well, what function is that plastic providing? Is it structural integrity? Is it maintaining liquids? Is it serving some sort of barrier? Is it for advertising? What function does it actually perform? Because function is really our bridge to the biology. And so once we understand that, then that gives us a solution space. So in the example of packaging, our client in this particular example was Natura, which is a cosmetics company out of Brazil. They own the Body Shop, and they're kind of a large player in the cosmetics personal care game and very mindful about their environmental impact. And so this project was about 8 years ago at this point. So they really wanted to look at the carbon impact of their packaging, understanding that, shampoo, for example, you're largely shipping water. And, what would it look like to actually reinvent what their packaging looked like with two primary goals, reducing carbon and reducing materials. And so the function that we were solving for this particular product was maintaining liquids. So how does nature maintain liquids? And we looked at all sorts of different organisms. And for example, one of the ideation sessions really latched onto this concept of a citrus fruit. So when you look at a citrus fruit, you have packaging within packaging within packaging. So you've got the pulp, which holds the liquids. The pulp is inside a section. The section is inside the fruit, which is inside the rind. And so you've got this beautiful kind of packaging example that we can start to emulate. And what they landed on in terms of maintaining liquid, what they identified was the shape of those pulp, the way that they lay in the section. The shape of that enabled an incredible amount of liquid to be captured within that section. So the package itself was emulated based on the shape of the pulp. So instead of like a round tubular bottle that you would expect, this became a very short and think of like a teardrop almost, or like a pulp of a fruit. That's the shape that it actually took. It actually emulated shape. And by doing that, they could lay a lot of the packages within a box that would then be shipped within a carton, within a crate, and so on and so forth. So by just changing the shape of that bottle, they were able to reduce the carbon of their distribution of that product by 50%, just by simply emulating the shape itself. But what's cool is like the win didn't stop there, right? So when we look at, and this is why biomimicry is so cool, because it's holistic design. So we got that design strategy. But then what we also got when we looked at maintaining liquids, the other issue that was really important to the client was getting out the last drop. So, because, the consumer, that was one of their consumer feedbacks is, we have the shampoo, but it's always annoying when there's like a little bit left in the bottle and you can't get it out. So the other component of that design was that the package would be, you could essentially get out the last drop through this essentially squeeze, like flattening the package, which normally you can't flatten a shampoo bottle, right? It's like almost like think of like a tube of toothpaste.
Yeah.
You know how like you roll it up and squeeze it out to the very last drop.
Right.
That's essentially what we were then able to do with the shampoo, the way that the packaging was designed. So it enabled to get out the last drop. It allowed for carbon reduction and it allowed for reduction of materials, right? So even the plastic it changed to a different type of plastic, but then it was also a reduced amount of plastic. So we essentially kind of solved for all these challenges by looking at all these strategies in nature in terms of how to get out the last drop, how to manage liquids, and looking at these organisms that enabled that to happen.
That's awesome. Wow. That's really cool. Yeah, looking to nature to solve problems that were already solved in nature, to apply them to a business sense to solve business problems today. That's really cool.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so cool. Yeah. I mean, and what's really fun about it is that in the process, like once you kind of show people like, okay, here's how nature does thermal regulation, we can look at polar bears, and you start to kind of look at like these strategies, and then like the light bulb goes off where it's like, oh, right. Like, of course, like nature has been doing this. Like it kind of becomes so obvious. It's like, right. Like, why isn't our first question, what would nature do? Because like there's an abundance of answers. And so it becomes, I think, particularly for teams that are problem solving, once you give them a few ideas in terms of this is how nature solved it, then the floodgates just start opening, right? We have this saying that we call, quiet your cleverness, because when we're in that solution space, we always pull on human-centered ideas, right? Like we look at best practices, we look at like, oh, how did, someone else solve this problem? And we just build from that. And when we bring to the solution space new ideas from nature, you're really kind of opening people up to an entirely new way of solving the problem. We've had ideation session teams come up with 100 new ideas that they've never even remotely touched before. So it's a really incredible tool for just even that, for just opening up the solution space.
Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think my innovation background really at City Innovation Labs, what we think of as all the time is really the currency of any startup. If you're looking at a startup or an enterprise startup in a larger organization, is learnings, right? How can you learn fast?
Yeah.
And so it's cool to see you like go, hey, you know what? Nature is there already are learnings that nature has done for us. Let's look to something that already works, which is kind of cool. Like rather than saying, let's go try and reinvent something, it's like, no. Like this has been around for a while. Let's go in the past and take a look at how nature does things. So yeah, Very cool.
Yeah. So another example to kind of blow it up even bigger is, so we talk a lot about nature being a model, a mentor, and measure. So we can actually look to nature, we can emulate forms, we can emulate process, and we can emulate systems. So one of the projects that we're probably most excited about right now is this initiative called Project Positive. And this is really an effort. It's a collaborative of companies that are all kind of working on this initiative moving towards positive. So moving away from doing less bad, or I should say moving beyond doing less bad. And what does it look like to be positive? So actually providing positive impact to the communities in which they serve and operate. What does that look like? So often when you are talking to people about sustainability, companies will have these like reduction goals. We're going to reduce our water consumption by 30%. We're going to reduce our carbon by X percent. Like they'll have these like reduction goals. And often those are based off of some kind of arbitrary goal of, we just want to reduce it. And so we started asking the question of, well, what does it look like to be positive? Instead of doing less bad, what would it look like to actually be positive? Instead of like having reduction goals, how could we have positive impacts? And so, what would nature do, right? It's looking to, well, how do ecosystems perform? And when we look at a system level, when we look at ecosystems, they're delivering what's called ecosystem services. So these are the value that we as humans get for free from nature. So clean air, clean water, things that nature is doing for us every day, all day, that we don't think about or even actually value into our kind of currency of products and services. But we can measure those. We can say, okay, well, this is how a forest is performing. It's sequestering, X amount of carbon. It's filtering this many pollutants at this rate. So we can actually start to quantify how ecosystems perform. And we can use that as a benchmark of this is what positive looks like. So we did our first kind of pilot of this project with Interface, which is a carpet tile manufacturing company, super forward thinking in sustainability, probably one of the top leaders in sustainability. So they've been a longtime partner of ours. And so when they were they were about to achieve their 2020 sustainability goals. And they essentially said, well, what's next? And what we essentially landed on is, well, let's lean into this idea of moving beyond less bad and moving into positive. And let's look at your facilities and let's look at, what would it look like for your factories to function like forests and to produce ecosystem services like the forest next door, because that gives you a science-based target that is locally relevant. So instead of just saying we want our facilities to sequester X amount of carbon, we can say we want our facilities in Amsterdam to sequester this rate of carbon because that's what the forest next door is doing. So then you have a goal that is locally relevant and science-based and data-driven, and therefore gives you kind of something to work towards that's positive. So these are very much kind of aspirational goals. So it's kind of launched this whole initiative of that particular pilot was called Factory as a Forest. We've done Campus as a Forest. We've looked at projects that are also in the desert. So, looking at like data centers that deliver that perform as desert ecosystems. So there's a lot of ways that you can actually look at facilities that perform like healthy ecosystems, and we can actually quantify that performance, set performance goals, and actually those become the targets in which companies are working towards to achieve positive impact and positive performance.
You mentioned data centers. Yeah, I've been able to tour some large data centers, and I know I like what you said with companies not just working towards being less bad, but being, more positive, right? More on the positives, because I think that's a huge trend I'm seeing in all of the data centers I'm touring is at Amazon, at Microsoft, at some of the big four. They're all looking at how do we be more positive. So that's a pretty cool thing to think through, is not just do less bad, but let's be better than that.
Exactly. Well, because that's the point that we're at, right? Like there's a pretty significant sense of urgency that we can't just keep operating at the rate we are. We can't be making these small incremental changes to help improve what we're doing. We need some pretty significant swings if we're really going to kind of change the impacts that we're having on our ecosystem and our planet. And so it becomes a really hopeful and possible way to talk about it, because it's like, if we're talking about, well, this is what nature does, right? Like, we know what's happening right now. Like, we know this ecosystem is healthy and that it's operating at this rate. And so why can't we be aiming for that same goal? And so I think that's another component of it, is that instead of coming at it from this doom and gloom, when we come in and say, well, hey, here's how nature is solving for water filtration. It's like, oh, okay, great. There's a strategy that does exist that we can emulate, versus this is too overwhelming. I'm not sure where to start, or, we've lost hope, whatever it may be. I think that's something that's so important right now, is coming at it not only, of course, from the place of hope, but it's possible. And look, here's an example, because that's so much of what people need to kind of help them step in, is just to see it's possible.
Right. That's great. Now, what would you say that takeaway for anyone listening to this podcast? What would you say, like, if you could give one free piece of advice?
In what context?
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it really open ended to you. Like,
in
all your learnings, all the things you've kind of thought through. I mean, could be something that's relevant to what we discussed, but what would be a takeaway?
Oh gosh, I think probably what I've learned the most since coming and joining Biomimicry and being part of this is just like the wonder and awe, like the amount that's happening. Like, when you go for a walk in the forest, what's happening around you is just so mind blowing. And I think we have just like a small scratch of the surface, right? Like, if you pick up just a handful of dirt, you have 10,000 organisms, in your hand, when you think about that and what they're all doing and working towards, and like these incredible symbioses that are happening to like make our world function. For me, I think what's been so inspiring is to take a step back and to really understand that it's happening, instead of just like going on a hike and trying to get to the top of the mountain as fast as I can to get a good workout in before my next meeting. It's like really kind of taking a pause to like really recognize all the kind of phenomenon that's happening around us, to really enable us as humans to thrive on this planet. And so just having more of that holistic understanding of how everything is connected, these small subtleties that we think are not relevant in terms of the decisions that we make today, the products that you buy for dinner tonight as you're on your way home from work, actually have some sort of implication to the ecosystems in which they were harvested. But I think just taking that pause and taking a beat to see how it's all intersected, and that as a kind of human operating and walking through this world, like, we hold so much power in the small decisions that we make in what we purchase. And I think that's what's, really become illuminated to me, is one, the value of the ecosystems and these organisms that surround us, and two, how can I make a difference in my everyday practices and purchases to protect them.
Yeah, that's good. I think a lot of us too often just kind of go about our own lives without really thinking of the consequences or thinking of the things that affect our decisions as we're doing it, right?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it's just too easy to do that.
We're flying so fast. The pace at which we're operating, it's like, I have to believe, my friends and I talk about this, like we have to be butting up against some sort of threshold, because it's like, you see this, and we talk about this a lot, particularly in the field of sustainability, like burnout, like people are operating at these paces that are just not sustainable. And so when you're flying that fast, we're missing so much. What I'm seeing is we're missing what we actually have power to have influence over. And I think that's where it kind of becomes exciting again, is like, if by taking that pause, which is hard to do in today's society, but you know how it goes. It's like one person does it within your social circle, and then the other person does it, and you start to really recognize that value of slowing down.
Oh, absolutely. That's awesome. I really appreciate your time, Nicole. It's been great chatting today. Anything else you would add to this interview at all that's like, hey, I have one more thing I want to say?
Oh, well, I would definitely get outside.
Yes.
And then I would like really invite people to ask the question, like next time they have a problem or they're sitting kind of thinking about an issue or something that they want to solve, to like actually pause and say, well, what would nature do? I didn't say this, but we also have our sister organization is the Biomimicry Institute. That's our nonprofit entity. And there's a site called asknature.org. And you can actually type in a question. What would nature do if I was looking at a particular issue? And there's a whole slew of strategies so that you can actually get a sense for how nature would solve that problem. So I would encourage people to do that. It's kind of a nice way to kind of dip your toe into looking at how nature solves some of the problems around us. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, I would invite people to do that for sure.
I'm on it right now. Definitely a very cool site. I appreciate it again, Nicole.
Guys, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been fun. So great meeting you.